I'm John Baxter. I'm one of the elders here. One of our co-pastors, Justin, who is normally our teaching pastor, is actually away at a conference today. Interestingly enough, it's a conference and a gathering on prayer. That's interesting because this summer our topic has been to learn about prayer in the book of Psalms. And we're going to continue to do that today as we look at Psalm 95. And we're going to talk this morning about learning to talk. Of course, learning to talk to God. But I think there's some parallels just simply in learning to talk. My wife and I served with Cru in the Boston area back in the 1970s, working on colleges. And I was there one day having a little meeting with a student at Tufts University there in Boston. But this student was from another country. He was an international student. And I was somewhat familiar with his ethnicity and language and stuff. And so we're in the discussion, and I want to take down his name. And I said, I just want to write down your name and your phone number. And so he starts telling me his name. And I said, what is that name? And he says it again and again and again. And finally I said, look, I'm so sorry, but this isn't working. I just turned my piece of paper around and handed him the pen and said, just write it out. So he writes down the name. He turns around to me. It wasn't some strange foreign name. It was a very recognizable name. And then it dawned on me. The problem wasn't that he was from a different country or that his name was something strange to me. The problem was he had learned to speak English in Boston. Now, I don't know if you know anything about Boston, where they pack the car. When we went to our church in Boston, when we first moved there, the first day a young lady came up to me and she said, hi, I'm Donna O'Connor. Her real name was Donna O'Connor. So I realized the trouble was he had learned to speak in this corporate setting called Boston, Massachusetts. And I was a good Southern boy raised in the South, and I had no clue what he was saying to me. So those sorts of experiences make me reflect on what it means to learn to talk. And I think without doubt that an essential aspect of learning to talk is that we do it communally. We do it with others. You can't learn to speak simply by yourself. You need people to speak with. And sort of the larger the group that you learn, that you're sharing this learning of communication with, the better you're going to speak. And what if that was simply true about prayer as well? Of course, there's an individual aspect of prayer. Many of the Psalms are the individual psalmists crying out to God. But there's also an essential corporate aspect to prayer. That we learn to talk to God corporately. And I think the key place that we learn to talk to God corporately, of course, there are prayer gatherings and things like that, but it's also in the very act of corporate worship. We learn to talk to God in corporate worship. Now, that's my thesis for you this morning, and I think Psalm 95 will back it up. Why don't we turn our attention to that psalm? It begins with some invitations. Invitations that start with the word come. We're invited to come and to worship with God. Come, it says, rejoicing in God's greatness. That's how the psalm begins. And the setting is, many scholars believe that this psalm, in a sense, was a call to worship. You know, 3 times a year, the nation of Israel was to gather in the city of Jerusalem for these national festivals like Passover and the Festival of Booths. And you can imagine the picture. You're there in Jerusalem, and just to the east of Jerusalem is this Mount of Olives. It's this high hill. And so you're coming down from the north with your family and all these friends with you from your village, coming to Jerusalem to participate in this great festival of worship. And you come over the crest of that Mount of Olives. And after this long journey, there it is, the city of Jerusalem. But right in front of you is this beautiful temple that Solomon had built. this great temple. And I imagine that after that journey, just the natural impulse would just be to break out into shouts, to break out into joy. And that's what the psalmist says. He says, come, let's shout joyfully to the Lord. Shout triumphantly to the rock of our salvation. Let's enter his presence with thanksgiving. Let's shout triumphantly to him in song. Why? The Lord is a great God. He's a great king above all gods. The depths of the earth are in his hand, and the mountain peaks are his. The sea is his. He made it. His hands formed the dry land. Now, the literary technique when he's talking about, the sea and the land, the depths and the heights, he's saying everything. It just includes everything. It's all inclusive. God is the maker, the controller, the sustainer, the provider of all things. He is a great God, great in power and wisdom and knowledge. He's a God who has made everything that we experience for his own goodness, his own pleasure. And with that fact, the people of Israel coming into the city could affirm that this great God, this great powerful God, he's our protector. He's our sustainer. He's sort of the guarantor that all of the chaos around us doesn't have the last word. Israel's a small little nation. It's the only nation in the entire world that we know that worshiped one God. Surrounding Israel in vastly greater numbers and power and might are these nations that worship many gods, pagan gods, often very, very cruel gods. And Israel always lives under threat of these forces that are coming in, whether it's Assyrians or Egyptians or Babylonians. And so this tiny little group of people depends completely on the greatness, the power, the protection of God. And so cresting that hill and seeing the temple, they're reminded that God is the creator of all things. He's the powerful, great maker of all things. And the instinct there is simply to burst into song, to shout, to be joyful, because of this guarantee that evil doesn't win, that chaos doesn't ultimately win. Just last night, I got an email from a very old friend of mine, and in that email he stated, you don't know this, but my daughter, an adult daughter, is in stage 4 of bone cancer. And so his life is now just overtaken by this chaos, this fallenness of the world, and since this evil of disease, he's just immersed in this raging sea of watching his daughter go through this terrible illness and ultimately to die. Every single one of us here knows chaos like that at some point in your life. Maybe some right now, if not in the past, it's going to be in the future. And every one of us in that moment of chaos is going to be tempted to think, well, God's not great. He's not able to protect. He's not able to have the last word in my life. And the psalm reminds us that if he's great enough to make all things, this earth, the heavens, the stars, he's great enough to control it. He's great enough to be the sustainer and the protector of our lives. So even in the midst of chaos, even in the midst of this sorrow, when we choose to gather, like they're choosing to gather and come to the festivals in Jerusalem, when we choose to gather and to rejoice in God and to shout in God, we're really exercising what you might call a foundational fact of our faith. Our lives may be in turmoil, but when we gather together and in that discipline and pattern of rejoicing before God together, we're reminding ourselves, we're instructing ourselves that in the end, God wins. Not the devil, not my frailty, but God wins. And it's a foundational, essential aspect of our faith, this expression of joy. And the psalmist says part of the places that we learn to talk this way, we learn to shout to God, we learn to exercise that choice to be joyful, is corporately, as we're called to come to his temple, come worship together. That's the first invitation. Now the second one changes the whole tone of the psalm. And there we're invited to come, but to reverently come before our Maker. Come bowing, come in humility. Verse 6 of Psalm 95 says, come, let's worship and bow down. Let's kneel before the Lord our Maker. Why again? For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep under his care. It's interesting, isn't it, that the statement of God's power and greatness and goodness and ultimate victory leads to just this exuberant, joyful shouting and singing. But now when we consider what our relationship with him is, what's the nature of this? Our Maker, our shepherd. Now we're invited to come and to bow and to worship. And maybe the transition in the event was now they've come down off the Mount of Olives and now they're entering into the gates of the city and they're actually entering into the courts of the temple. And the shouting gives way to just a sense of majesty and awe and humility and bowing and worship. And we're bowing and worshiping because we're affirming you are our Maker. Not just that you made all things, but you made me. You made this people. And not only are you just simply our Maker, that you have the right over us, you in a sense, you own us, but you also are good to us. You're not just a Maker, but you are our God. You declare yourself to be identified with us. You're not ashamed to be known as the God of this people. And it's right that I should have this allegiance to you because not only did you make us and you identify with us, but you are a good shepherd to us. You care for us like a shepherd cares for his flock who knows them individually and values each single one. And you desire to lead us and care for us that way. And this recognition that it's not just simply that God is this great being out there, but somehow I'm in this relationship of care and goodness with him, that this would lead me to bow before him. That in humility I would acknowledge, in a sense, his right. In humility this is an act of submission, another one of these foundational acts of our faith. You are a good God. You made me. You own me. You care for me. And so in this act of homage and loyalty, it's an expression of a deep trust that's displaying itself when I'm following the shepherd who I know is good. When I'm displaying this trust by doing the things that he asks, by believing him and patterning my life after him. And again, this is part of, in a sense, of communicating with God. So I'm worshiping by shouting and joyfully expressing God's greatness and goodness. And I'm worshiping God when I'm humbly acknowledging that he's my owner, my Lord, my Maker, and yet he's a good God. And both of these things are patterned as we do it in corporate worship. So there are times when we're singing and shouting joyfully. And just a minute ago, we went through communion, and there's this reverential humbling of our hearts before God and saying, look, here are these elements, this bread and this wine. Not only did you make me, but you've bought me on a cross. These are the markers of how much you care for me. And so I submit to you gladly, willingly, humbly, saying, you're smarter, you're wiser, you're better than I. I will follow my shepherd. Both of those phases, both of those poles of learning to talk to God, we practice those as we gather together in corporate worship. So I think clearly the application for us is that we have to affirm again and again and again the importance of corporate worship for ourselves, for our families, for our children, if we really are going to learn how to be in communion with God, how to talk to God, how to pray to God, both joyfully about His greatness and reverentially about His goodness. I know some of you, many of you perhaps, like me, I grew up in a church. And I, in a sense, grew up in a church where we learned our prayers. It was a liturgical church. And year after year, I was brought by my parents, for which I am thankful, and patterned in corporate worship. And in that time of corporate worshiping and learning these prayers, learning how to talk to God. That's a pattern maybe many of you have had. And by doing it corporately, just in the same way that we learn language together, by worshiping God as a body, in a sense, our vocabulary grows. Our understanding, our comprehension, our ability to relate to God in deeper and deeper ways grows in the same way that your vocabulary and your understanding and your experience of the world grows as you know more and more people and are in conversation with more and more people. So the depth of our relationship grows as we pattern ourselves in these disciplines of worshiping God joyfully, bowing before Him in humble submission because of His goodness towards us. These patterns are built into us. And one of the most important ways is when we gather corporately. It's part of God's plan for us. It's how His grace, in a sense, is communicated to us. This importance of corporate prayer. But I had one little problem. Patterned, and thankfully so. Even when I left and went up to the university, I continued to go to church, but I had one slight problem. I didn't actually know God at all. I was going to worship, but I didn't know the God really whom I was worshiping. I knew a lot about Him. I've grown up in the church. But it was sort of the same way that I knew a lot about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, knew a lot of facts about them, but I had never met either of those individuals. And so I arrived at the university being sort of a church person, but not really knowing God. And that's the danger, the trouble that the psalmist wants to address in the rest of the psalm. So there's still this invitation to come, but there's a concern, there's a warning. You've got to come carefully with a trusting heart. It's not enough just to show up with your body. And so the psalmist goes on and he says this. He says, today, if you hear His voice, remember the pilgrims are coming down off the mountain. They've entered into the temple and they've reverently bowed, and now there's this warning. Okay, you're here at the temple, but today, right now, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on that day at Massah in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested me. They tried me, though they had seen what I did. For 40 years I was disgusted, that's a pretty strong word, with that generation. I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray. They do not know my ways. I swore in my anger, they will not enter my rest. Wow. So this warning, this concern starts with a statement that today if you hear His voice, so the assumption is God's speaking. God's calling out to His people. You know, a couple of weeks ago, together we looked at Psalm 77, and we talked about those times where it seems that God is silent. And we talked about, in a sense, how do we learn to hear God, and how those times of silence weren't so much that God had left, but rather that we needed, in a sense, to grow a better set of ears. We needed God to transform our hearts and to use that time even of silence and difficulty so that we can hear Him. And here again, that's what He's saying. His voice is there. He's calling. But they didn't have ears to listen. Why? because of who they were, because of the hardness of their heart. And he gives them, in a sense, an example. He says, I showed you these great wonders when I brought the people out of Egypt, and the plagues and the Passover night, and then the parting of the Red Sea, even though you were chased by the armies of Pharaoh and you crossed the Red Sea and the army was destroyed. And now they're in the wilderness. They're heading towards Mount Sinai. And they come to a place called Rephidim, and there's no water. And so what do? They begin to grumble and complain. Actually, it's in Exodus 17, and it's more serious than that. They even talk about getting rid of Moses. So they really are, in a sense, angry about their plight. And it says that they tested God. They, in a sense, they're demanding that God prove to them who he is, instead of graciously trusting and believing God. So he calls the place Meribah and Massah, which is grumbling and testing. Because, in a sense, these old patterns that they must have just grown up in under Egypt, where they're simply slaves and afraid of Pharaoh and simply have no trust in others. Now God has brought them out with these great miraculous deliverance, but still they allow these old patterns of fear, anxiety, anger to bubble up, and they refuse to trust God. And these old patterns are still hardening their hearts. And we know from the events in the book of Exodus that this continues. Actually, God will say later on that you tested me 10 different times in the wilderness. You wouldn't allow me to, in a sense, repattern your heart. So finally they come up to the very entrance of the land, of the promised land, the land of Canaan, and they send spies out to the land in Numbers 14. And the spies come back, and 10 of them say, we can't do this. The people up there are just too strong. And again, instead of listening to God and trusting him, these old, in a sense, patterns with God, this fear takes over, and they rebel against God, and they refuse to take the land. And that's when God, in Numbers 14, he says, I swore in my anger, you'll not enter into my rest, because you don't believe I'm great. You refuse to believe that I can take this land, that I can provide for you. You don't really believe that I'm good, that I'm your shepherd, that I care for you, that I'll provide water and food for you. You, even though you've seen all these things, somehow you refuse to affirm them. And so he says, you won't enter my rest. And rest in the Old Testament really means, in a sense, God's salvation. It's the place of God's sustaining, his provision, his protection, but most importantly, it's a place of his presence. And that rest is most clearly symbolized in the temple. And so as they come down off the mountain and they reverentially come into the temple, they're to know this symbolizes the place of God's rest, of his presence, his protection, his sustaining. And yet the danger is they can do this whole journey. They can be shouting, they can be bowing, they can come into the temple, and God won't be there. They can go through all the outward motions, and yet the danger is God won't be there. And so there's a sense in which that danger could apply to us. It was what was applying to me. I had gone to church my whole life. I enjoyed the hymns. All my friends were at church. I had a great time. And yet when I came to church, God wasn't really there. His voice was there, but because of my heart, I didn't have the ears to hear it. That's the fallen condition. That's the condition of all of us. And actually, even after we come to know Jesus and his salvation, those patterns don't just miraculously disappear. They still are the way in which we operate. We expect to operate. When difficulty comes, when that chaos rears its terrible head, when we begin to doubt about God's greatness and his goodness, we begin to harden our heart. We allow, as the writer of Hebrews says, the deceitfulness of sin to harden our heart. So when we're not listening to God's voice, when we're not tuned into it, we'll begin to listen to other voices. We'll begin to listen to other voices that say, well, here's the way of comfort. Here's the way of security. Here's the way of control. And even though we may appear in church, we may come to the temple, if our hearts are deceitfully hardened, we're really worshiping other things, these other idols, these other things that during the rest of the week, we're giving our hearts to. And the warning is that we can't let that happen, because it destroys us. Just as the people of Israel, it says here in the text that they wandered in their hearts. They weren't listening to him. They wandered away from his ways, from believing that he really cares for us. He knows what's best. And because they wandered in their hearts, they wandered in the desert for 40 years until every one of that generation had died. And so to wander away from God, to not enter into his rest, is to invite our destruction. That's why the psalmist cares so much. Come, he says. Come and learn to talk to God out of this foundation of joy over his greatness. Come and reverentially submit to God and appeal to him as your maker and your caring and good shepherd. But in that action, never be tempted, or of course we will be tempted, but don't allow that temptation to take root, that somehow the ritual substitutes for God's presence. That just the being here physically substitutes for our hearts that's tender to God, to listen corporately as we come to each week, God saying, where is it that your heart is being deceitfully hardened? Where is it that you're being tricked to think that there's something else out there that's greater than I or better than I? Here you are together practicing these patterns of trusting me, of rejoicing before me, of believing me. Now listen to me. Hear my voice. Where today is the deceitfulness of sin causing us to harden our hearts? So that's another application. That's another great benefit of learning to talk to God corporately together, that when we come, as the writer of Hebrews says, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together, because when we're coming together and we're talking to God and we're talking to each other, we're encouraged to have our hearts softened. And then, unlike me in early days of college, going to church and not finding God, but actually coming together and finding him. The solution for that fallen condition, that solution that for the problem that was plaguing me all those years was, of course, always the same. Jesus says, come to me, and I will give you rest. He doesn't expect us to not have that tendency, that fallen condition, to always somehow be hardening our hearts like the people of Israel in the desert. His solution is that when we experience those things, to choose to come to him, lay it before him. He's powerful enough through his cross and his salvation, his resurrection, and the indwelling of his Holy Spirit. He's powerful enough to transform our hearts, and he's gracious enough to always want to. Come, he says. Come to me, not just a gathering of people, but corporately coming to meet me, Jesus says, and I'll give you rest. Let's talk to him together this morning about where our hearts are. Father, thank you for this song. Thank you for this instruction of worshiping together. Thank you for this, in a sense, this means of grace, this patterning for us and our families. That this is how, one of the ways you want to teach us to draw near to you and to experience a richness in our relationship with you. We thank you that you are the great God. We thank that you are the good God. And by faith we trust that. But Lord, we also thank you for these times when we gather together so that we can hear from you and hear from each other and in a sense, open up our hands and lay them before you and say, Lord, show me where this week has this deceitfulness of sin caused me to believe that you're not great towards me, you're not good towards me, that something else would be better for me. Lord, this morning, would you show us? Is it anger? Is it lust? Is it control? Where are these areas that I'm having a difficult time believing that you're great and you're good towards me? Lord, take them. Forgive them. Heal them and transform us. We ask these things together, corporately, as we worship you, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.